welcome to our Discovery Dialogue. We've got a bunch of our class cohort 7 folks I see in the front row. And first, let me welcome Andrew Winston, our special guest today, an old friend of mine. Hi, Andrew.
Hi, good to be here.
And for those with their faces hiding, it's always more fun if we can see each other. So come on into the room if you can, if you're not indecently exposed or whatever, and say hi to Andrew. So I thought, Andrew and I were just chatting before, and you're going to find out Andrew has no shortage of things to share on this topic. But we were sort of joking, saying like, well, how do we start this conversation off on a positive note, given what's happening in the world, particularly in the United States, with the absolute insane blowback against anything that smells of a sustainability agenda.
Yeah.
And so maybe we kick off by starting on the positive note. I also just want to sort of put out on the table the reality that we have two old white guys talking about ESG and DEI, and that may cause some people discomfort, and I get that. But this is the Discovery Dialogue is not meant to be a kind of a broad forum on any individual topic. I invite people in who have a particular perspective to share on a topic that's particularly relevant. And so, of all the people that I know who have spent, literally, I believe, Andrew, your entire career, and certainly the majority of it in the corporate sustainability conversation, and in
It's now the
particular,
majority, yeah. I did have about 10 years before. I'm
yeah, you were a
120 years
consultant.
old.
You were a consultant back in the
I
day,
was at
weren't you?
BCG and then I was in the media world for a little while.
Okay.
Like last job was at Viacom at MTV, strategy stuff,
Yeah.
regular job.
But Andrew is he's a sought after advisor, thought leader, speaker in this corporate sustainability conversation, and very plugged in, or way more plugged in than I am, particularly with the kind of Fortune 500 type companies. So, any rate, it's great to have you with us to help us try to make sense of what's going on in the world, Andrew. And let's do kick it off. I think everyone knows the context of particularly what's happening in the United States. But help us, with some good news, with some positive perspective before we dive into the challenges.
Okay. So first, thanks for having me. It's good to see you. John and I used to get together for like brunch at this little place in our town before
Yeah, we
you
used to be neighbors before I
before you left and went to live in
head
someplace
up the
calmer and
turnpike.
more beautiful, and just kick around how broken capitalism is. So I think we kind of agree on all that. But I think I get asked a lot now, like, what are you so optimistic about? Because it is hard. I mean, let's be honest. These are, if you care about any of the justice, climate, sustainability agenda, this is hard. As a colleague of mine said, it's a weird mix because you have to kind of find joy and be with your family and friends and watch a lot get destroyed, and it's what's happening. But I believe there's a bunch of things that are unstoppable, and some of them are just kind of mega trends like increased transparency. They're going to delete data, they're going to hide stuff here, but it's really hard, increasingly with reporting requirements, everything. There's going to be more and more sharing. I believe there's generational change that is unstoppable. The norms change over time because old views die out, and that's usually because literally they die out, right? Older generations go, younger people come. Millennials and Gen Z are basically now the majority of the workforce, and on average, they have a better view of this stuff. I mean, Gen Z doesn't really doubt climate change, right? With the caveat that the rise of the bro culture in the US is
Yeah, I was
problematic.
going to
We could
say, other
talk,
than this
it's bad. And I have two Gen Z boys, and
masculine right
uh,
wing
they've
bro
avoided it
culture.
so far, but the algorithm is feeding them stuff. But generationally, things will improve, right? My Gen Z boys don't understand what our problem is with gender, sexuality. Like it's just more understood for them, and so this is how things progress. But the thing that I guess just tactically optimistic about is just the clean economy. It's happening. the U.S. is going to do everything it can to slow it, but it's unstoppable in part because it's cheaper, right? We've hit that tipping point where most of these technologies now are fundamentally more economic, and we could debate how much voluntary corporate action has ever mattered, and I think I'm probably closer to John than he thinks on this, that I think you could argue that companies have only done as much as is profitable, and renewables are now profitable. There's also a lot of money out the door, or companies have signed 20-year power purchasing agreements on solar. They can't unravel that because the orange man is mad, so it's
Yeah,
moving.
although
And
just I mean, one of the things, and now we're already leaving the optimist part,
yeah,
but I
don't do
mean,
that. I'm not done with the good news. We got like,
well, one of the
okay.
things that just blew me away is that, they're building offshore wind up near where I live,
Mm,
and there's a multi-billion-dollar project that's more than half built that has
hmm.
been attacked by an executive order
Yep.
and instructed to stop work. And this is,
I
with a,
No, they're gonna hurt stuff. They're doing it. I mean, I think Thomas Friedman wrote something recently about we may become like um, Cuba, where you come to see old cars and old
yeah,
technologies.
yeah,
Like
yeah,
we'll be
we
behind.
already
But
are.
I would just say optimistically, I travel a lot. I was in China a few weeks ago. I was in South America. In general, the dialogue is still continuing. I was at a big mining conference this week speaking, and mining is not moving away from discussions of how do they do what they do sustainably. They're also in the path of the clean economy, and they're
Yeah.
necessary for us to get all the metals we need. So they're optimistic too,
Mm.
but just the economics on everything related to clean economy, the examples of things like grids in particular regions, like operating on storage for hours at a time, which just a few years ago seemed impossible.
Impossible. Yeah.
And my favorite
Yeah.
little stats, just to end it, is I think last October, China passed the point where light vehicle sales over half were EVs. Not like 10%, not like a normal tipping point, but half. And I just saw this week that over half, I think 57% of three-wheeled scooters in India now sold are EVs.
Mm.
So there's really good news on that front, and we're winning. Last year 2 trillion was invested in clean economy versus 1 trillion in fossil fuels. So it's hard not to be optimistic that we will have a green grid, we will have EVs, and hopefully more public transportation and all that. But we're going to get there. It's not fast
Slow.
enough. We know that.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
so John, what are you optimistic about? Because you can be pretty dark,
Uh,
but you seem like a
um,
happy guy.
yeah, to be honest, I'm struggling to be optimistic right now.
That's not
I'm,
fair. You made me come up with something.
yeah, no, because you got all the facts and figures. I do think living in the United States right now is really difficult, and particularly with what's happening on what I'll call the social side. And it's almost like there's a new fire burning, and you have to drop what you're doing and
Hmm.
figure out how to deal with the fire the
Yep.
last thing you needed was another fire to deal with. So
Yeah.
I'm trying to figure that out. I guess philosophically, I'm the guy that's been running around saying we need, a metamorphosis, not incremental change.
Right.
And I know from the study of how system change happens that that only happens in response to pressure, and that, a metamorphosis is not all pretty and it's not all smooth. And it requires massive disturbance. And
Yep.
so philosophically, I comfort myself that, had the US election gone the other way, we would be continuing down the incremental path. And I'm not smart enough to know how this disturbance, let's call it, might in the end turn out to accelerate where we're going to be 10 years from now. And that's
That's
um,
an optimistic view, that the
yeah,
complete destruction of our norms and things. I mean, look, and yes, it's possible. I agree.
yeah.
We
I'm
could
not
probably have a
saying
long
that's
conversation about
logical.
increment. Yeah, we could have a long
Uh,
conversation about what incremental is. I mean, I think our mutual friend Hunter Levins, I think the way she talks about it has always been good, which is call it incremental, whatever you want, efficiency, getting more renewables on the grid. It buys us time
buys time. Yeah,
to get more
yeah.
people to the table. I think
Totally agree.
I always see my job in the world as fundamentally getting business people to the table, not looking threatening. I mean, Hunter actually introduced me once to some board person saying, this is the guy you put in front of the board, like gray-haired guy, you can put on a suit, like I can look like it, and they don't know I'm radical until like I
Yeah,
start talking. And so that helps, I guess. But I kind of feel like my job is to get as many people to the table as possible, and then the table's on wheels, and I'm just kind of pulling it and like
yeah,
trying to move it towards
yeah,
regenerative, net positive, whatever you want to call it. And I think
yeah,
I agree we need deep system change, but and we need policy change, but I don't know. I guess I don't know how that comes completely from the outside, given the level of power business has. So
yeah,
I've gone down the path of what seems nearly impossible, which is convince business to
yeah,
help change policy, as we were talking about before we got on.
yeah.
It, it's
Let's
hard.
let's
We're tilting at windmills, right?
yeah. Let's come back to the sort of what needs to be done in a second, but I'm sure everyone is curious, and you've got sort of in my mind, an insider's perspective on what are the conversations that are happening, behind closed doors in some of these big companies. And I know you've been very vocal about Target in particular, but help us make sense of how companies have been all in on DEI, ESG,
Yeah.
performance reporting on metrics and da 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 da, da, and then the most powerful companies in the world suddenly not only going silent but reversing course as if they're little puppies.
Yeah,
Uh,
it's
what the hell's going on?
I yeah, I have an article, it should be going live in the day or two on MIT Sloan about courage. They suggested I do that because I had a courage TED talk I did last fall, and I had trouble writing it. I was delaying because what I wanted to write was "You're all cowards." And I was like, how do I do this nicely? How do I say this in a productive way? It's been scary. I've been really, really unimpressed with business leadership. It's been heartening to see Harvard and others finally stand up, but that week that Paul Weiss and Columbia both folded was bad. And I was like, oh, we're done, I I think so. There's one conversation I was privy to and with a client, and the CEO's in the room, and it was a company that has some traditional products but also plays in some clean economy related stuff. So they're all for the transition. And he said we're going to keep doing everything we're doing on climate. I think he said on DEI, whatever he said, but we're not going to stick our chins out. And to me, that's the perfect distillation of what's like. I've heard a version of that. They are all trying to lay low. And I don't know why they think like the shadow of death is going to pass over them. Because if you give in, appeasement doesn't work. And they just ask for more and more. It's the old kids book, if you give a mouse a cookie, like they just keep coming. And
Mm,
I've been surprised hearing different conversations. I mean, I'm not going to claim to be sitting and talking to CEOs all the time. Most people who say that are making it up. But I have enough, I guess, that everybody's kind of operating in their own silo. And I've been really shocked they haven't come together. Collective courage, I think, is the answer. That's what I keep writing and talking
well, it
about.
was interesting, the big box stores came together to beat them up about tariffs.
Right. Oh, it's amazing. Right.
Where
It's amazing how they'll do that. And they come together through the chamber on anything they don't
yeah,
like trade wise. But they
yeah,
let themselves, I mean, I say this, I'm not being snide, but we have basically oligopolies now. We haven't broken anything up in years. So in a lot of sectors, there's four, five, six companies that are a
yeah,
huge percentage. Why aren't they using that power? Right?
yeah,
Like the big four, most of them folded immediately when
yeah,
they said, oh, because they're government contracts. But I said to a couple partners at one of them, like, but there's only like four of you. What are they going to do? Not hire any of you if you just came together and
right,
said we're going to still hire?
right,
I don't
right.
know why more companies just didn't do what only Costco has done, which is just say we're going to keep doing this. And
Yeah.
there you go. So look, I
I
think what's happening in these boardrooms is, I mean, look, you and I have talked for years, like their incentives are just their short-term profits and keeping the stock going for their options. And there's generational wealth awaiting the top 100 people in big companies if they keep the stock going up. I mean, not a little bit of money, but in that
right,
same room of
exactly.
we're not going to stick our chin out, I looked around at four guys, all older white guys, all wearing the same outfit, and looked at the finance.yahoo insider and realized they were all worth tens of millions of dollars. I'm like, well, no wonder you
Exactly.
can't get long-term change.
Yeah.
I've been
Yeah.
I've been surprised at the lack of foresight about what happens if you give in. But also right before the election in one of these rooms, head of government affairs was talking about immigration if Trump won and didn't have on the list deportations. And I said, why aren't you doing scenarios on that? Oh, that's not going to happen. I can't believe how often I heard stuff like that. I'm like, but they ran on it and they put out an 800-page plan, and they're doing it. So I think there's been a lack of foresight, and for me, fundamentally, very clearly, you were talking about Robbie Starbuck, the guy who's been pushing, using social media. And
Come back to him in a second. We'll come
yeah,
back to
but
him in a
just
second.
that companies folded to him because, like Target, Walmart, others, they clearly saw a huge potential cost if there was a boycott, or if the regressives, I'll call them, the anti-progressives, came after them. But to me, there's been like this systematic undervaluation of what happens if you do give in. What does that say to your employees, your customers, everybody? And I think Target
And
completely
Target's
screwed
an
up.
example of that.
Completely screwed up. And I said this back in last May when they pulled merchandise. I just wrote, this is a big mistake on LinkedIn. It's very clear. And I'll end with on this thought that an economist friend of mine is a senior guy and economist in the country, and he just said to me, really basically, like, I don't get these companies pulling back from DEI. Don't they want to be able to hire people? Because the under 25 crowd in the US is plurality white now, right? It is more diverse. So this isn't about pleasing some particular group. It's like just purely on profit and on self-interest. How can you hire and attract customers if you're not looking like them and speaking like them? And so I don't
Well,
know. I mean,
there is the Harvard law case. You probably have the specifics better than I, but the Harvard lost a case um, on their recruiting, their
the admissions, the
admissions process.
Supreme Court case, you mean?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I mean, I've had one conversation with a friend who's the director of a very big bank, and when I pressed him, he pointed to that, and he said the CEO essentially made the decision and told the decision to the board, we're not going to break the law.
Right.
And there's truth to that. And
What do you think that meant, though? What law? Like they hadn't, I mean, like a statement, you mean the government saying we don't like this anymore, don't do it, because that hadn't been
they were
tried.
worried that their recruiting process could be
Oh,
deemed
yeah, I see. From that
illegal.
case, a
Yeah,
smart friend of mine said, well, that was a lot of over and pre-complying. When business took
right.
that admissions case for
Yeah,
schools and said, we're
exactly.
going to how about you let it get to the Supreme Court first on
Yeah,
corporate
yeah,
recruiting?
exactly.
It's a
Yeah,
totally different thing than college admissions. It's not the same system.
yeah, yeah.
Um, yeah,
And
that
the business
decision,
judgment rule, I mean,
right,
I
right.
just don't understand how a board can't assert that it is our judgment that this is good. This is a good decision for our business. Leave
Right,
aside the ethical, moral
right.
issues, just just for our business. But
That's what,
that was his response, and that's how one bank made that decision. And
I mean,
there
why
was
do you
remarkably
think,
little conversation after that statement was made.
I mean, the banks a lot better than I do. I mean, is there something in their makeup that makes them like, are they, I guess I don't know, they're more afraid of legal stuff than other
Yeah, I think it
sectors?
gets back to what you were saying earlier. I mean, the next part of the conversation was that there's some, the banks, basically the banks' return on equity is a function of the capital rules. It's a very
Right.
technical. And so how the capital rules uh, are written and how they might change can dramatically affect the amount of capital banks need for different businesses, and therefore the profitability of each of those businesses. And ultimately, it determines how much of their stock they can buy back. These
Mm,
are the big banks that are basically not growing much anymore. And there's something that the Treasury Secretary, what's his name?
I don't remember. I'm
Yeah.
trying to block all names of this
Uh,
administration.
he's working on something that is apparently a reasonable adjustment to the capital requirements from a not practical, from a logical point of view, that from the bank's point of view would make the capital ratios more rational. And
Mm,
by the way, less onerous. And so that's so important to them that I think they're just ducking on things that are, in a sense, more important to society. And
it's
this is a friend
but
of mine who's a good guy. It's not like, he's some whack job. but that's how they think.
Yeah, it's Scott Bessent. I just because
Got percent, yeah.
yeah, I just pulled up this news item. I'll put it in the chat that I saw this morning that he's out pushing the IMF and the World Bank to stop. I think the three things I
Yeah,
saw was climate, diversity, and something that it was mission creep, right? You know, the logic behind that statement is really something like providing energy to the world is mission
yeah,
creep, right? I
yeah,
mean, providing energy in the newest form, the cheapest form, the easiest to do in a more distributed fashion.
yeah.
That's, a good leapfrog technology. I mean, there's obviously so many reasons, but I don't know.
So
I look, I think
this same guy used to work with Bissett, and I
really,
said, and everyone I've asked who knows him said he's a smart guy, blah blah blah, and a decent guy, definitely conservative political views, but not like George Bush conservative, not
right.
not whatever this is,
Doesn't George Bush
and
look great now? Wouldn't you love to
yeah,
have George Bush
want
back?
to get Nixon, bring back Nixon, right?
Oh my God, I would love Nixon at this. I'm too young to,
Karen
you
says
know,
no.
I was born during his administration, but I mean, I take like a toaster over this, but but George Bush, my God, just dumb instead of dumb and malicious. I'm
Yeah.
sorry if there's any Trump supporters on the call. I'm really doubting it, but um, you know, it's just malicious
Well,
what's going on.
what he said, because I said, well, how could someone who's level-headed and a decent human being do, basically do the bidding for this,
Yeah,
and he said, John, you're naive. These people want these jobs so bad,
yeah.
they'll do anything to get them and anything to keep them. And it was a real awakening for me because I am naive about that kind of stuff, I think. And it didn't help my day, but what he said.
All right, someone pointed out in the chat that Bush and Cheney were malicious. Okay, fair enough. Um, you know,
Who's you
I
what?
think that Bush and Cheney were malicious. Fair.
Yeah, they definitely
Um,
were.
uh,
Definitely were.
they weren't quite as effective, maybe. I, I just wonder. What I always wonder about these guys now is partly that mirror conversation in the morning. What are they telling
Yeah.
themselves? And I always wonder about these more economic guys who just clearly just want to push for the smallest, the neoliberal, dream. Do they really believe what I think some of the early neoliberal stuff was still had, which was that if we, shrink the government, if we, the whole, that trickle down works. I think early on, those economists believed it did lead to some kind of better total outcome for society. That
Yeah.
latter half of the sentence of so we're better off kind of dropped in the last 20, 30 years. And now it's just small government, low taxes for no other reason than
Right.
just more money for the top. I
Yes.
just wonder if
Yeah.
these guys really believe that this path, this neoliberal dream of no government is somehow better, or is it just it enriches them? I mean, I don't want to be fully cynical and say it just enriches them. I think
Yeah.
some must still believe it. Um,
I think so. I mean, I was listening to an interesting, it should have been interesting debate between Stephanie Kelton and Steve Moore about should we be panicked about the deficits? And have you followed Stephanie Kelton's modern
yeah,
monetary
Stephen Moore
theory
from the Wall
stuff?
Street Journal, that dude, the board of the Journal,
Yeah,
Stephen Moore. Yeah,
yeah, yeah. So
he
it turns
said
out he was the author of the Project 2025 chapter on the Treasury Department.
okay,
And so, he and Musk and Ray Dalio are out talking about how, you know, the US is going to go bankrupt if we don't cut the deficit. And we're getting a little bit off track here, but just to respond to your question, he just rattled on and on and on about how we have to grow the economy to shrink the deficit or we're all doomed. And
right,
um, and he never responded to Stephanie's very articulate explanation of how deficits actually work and
right,
how when you're when you're issuing debt in your own currency, and particularly when it's the reserve currency, there's no like cliff that you run into the way you do if you're issuing foreign currency debt. but he didn't even argue or debate it. He just kept going back to his
Right.
growth rope. So I
Right.
don't know. I I know this. I asked that same question to Rob Johnson once, who's a very, senior economist and knows a lot of these people. And his view was it's ideology. It's
Yeah.
not intellect. It's identity and ideology more
It's a
than
story.
genuine intellect.
I mean, like, fundamentally, my job is a storyteller. I write, I give speeches. I'm trying to change the narrative and identify the narrative that we're swimming in. I
Yeah.
recommend strongly a book I've been reading in pieces over like a year or two because it's heavy. The Big Myth by Naomi Oreskes. It is a
Oh,
thorough look at this neoliberal story, and I knew kind of going back to Milton Friedman and some of the
yeah.
influences of him on him from like Hayek and those guys, and the Powell Memorandum, if you know about that in
Yeah.
the 70s. I kind of
Yeah.
knew
Yeah.
going back 50 years. I didn't know how far back it actually went. That literally 100 years ago, the same groups, National Association of Manufacturers, the Chamber, were pushing against child labor laws, right? Like this will be too expensive if we, it'll raise costs. It was the same stuff,
Mm.
and they started a concerted effort over more than 100 years now to tell a story that freedom. It's what I mean, and you see it today when Bezos said the Washington Post can only write about um,
Right.
personal liberties and what was it? It was two things: freedom. Like it was free. It was two things that
Freedom.
are actually at odds sometimes,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Like, and it has been such a successful story that it's for me the thing I struggle with the most is how do we swim against this tide when it's so
Yeah.
dominant that
Well, and
even in
what's so disappointing is it's been resurrected by this
right,
next generation of
right,
tech bros, as if they
right.
discovered Ayn Rand for the first time.
Right,
Hey,
I know.
I did.
And they want to build like offshore cities and like they want to do
Yeah,
what they did in Atlas Shrugged, like have their own little. I'm like,
yeah,
great, go. Like
yeah.
go and see what happens when you don't have any food. Like I just,
Right.
I kind of wish they'd do it, but you add the oligarchy or whatever, the tech guys, it adds also this intense belief that tech is always the solution, right? You throw
Right.
that into the
Right.
mix and it gets really, it gets really
It's very
dangerous.
dangerous.
No,
Yeah, let me
it's
circle
back.
back. I just want to just because not everyone is probably familiar with the Target story, and you
Yeah.
were very vocal on that. So just share with us what happened
Yeah.
and what.
So let's take us back to the the long ago days of early 2024. Actually, in mid 2023, it was, I think, first when Target started getting pressure, social media, some local groups around different stores, pressure about them having Pride Month or Pride Week merchandise, merchandise targeted at LGBTQ people.
And
There was
even
some
a
particular,
kind of a section in the
there
store,
was
as
a
I remember.
section or up front. I mean, it's like what they
Yeah,
do in Christmas. It's what they do,
right,
like it's the same
right.
thing. I think there were some specific concerns about some things that were trans related, like a bathing suit for people that were, in transition. Like there were some particular things, but for the most part, I believe that the merchandise was literally like a rainbow flag shirt, like it was that
Yeah,
kind of
yeah, yeah.
stuff. And they got a lot of pressure in 23 and it built again in 24. And they announced, I think in May last year, that the June Pride Month, they would pull the merchandise back. They wouldn't put it up front in like a couple thousand of the
And
stores that were
was it
basically
this guy Robbie Starbucks who
um
created the pressure?
I don't think that was him. I think
Uh-huh.
he was all over Walmart. I can't remember now, actually. I
Okay.
think it was before his time in the Sun, but I'd have to go back and look. But
Someone on social media was
yeah, they
agitating.
were threatening boycotts. And it was also around the time of the Bud Light thing. If you remember Bud Light,
Yeah.
someone in marketing sent a can to a trans influencer and people lost their minds you know um, and the story that went around in business very clear, and you can still see articles about this, is that Bud Light and Target, by going too woke, lost sales. I think that's been an incredibly unnuanced take because what you don't know, and I think we're getting some more evidence now, is how much of the loss was because of their reaction, like that they actually went back on just I mean, all if Bud Light had literally just said, "Yeah, we sent a can to someone. We think everyone should love Bud Light," I think they probably would have been better off. And I think
Mm.
Target. So in last year they pulled the merchandise back in the stores in red communities. Now, to give them credit or to be fair, they were facing actual like bomb threats in some places. There was violence. Um, but I truly believe this is a slippery slope thing. If you give in to violent rhetoric, you're just asking them to ask for more. And I just
Yep.
thought from a
Yeah.
business perspective, it was a really bad idea. And you're seeing now, they then followed that up in this January with kind of a pullback on their own DEI and their own, like changing the language, saying we're not going to do as much around, I think, black-owned suppliers, around their own employees, and they that yielded a boycott coming from some black churches and other organizations. And I just saw an article yesterday that their foot traffic is down like noticeably especially since January. So
Mm.
it has hurt them. And so the CEO is out there now having a meeting with Al Sharpton, like he's trying to do this outreach. But the damage I think they did, because Target was known actually for doing a lot in LGBTQ. They were an
Yeah.
ally. Their first, and part of what I called them out on was that if you went to their website when they pulled the merchandise back, the first value listed on their site was inclusivity. And I was like, this makes it far worse because you've now gone against your own stated values. And what does that tell your employees and the community? So I just think it was really poor, even if you just took a business perspective and again looked at younger people and their values. I saw a stat that 30% of Gen Z identifies in some way with LGBTQ, a huge number. And so who are you talking to if you're Target? So I think it was a very tough choice. I get it, but it felt to me like if there was a threat of violence, you call the FBI, right? You call the police, you do something about it as a crime. You don't just give in,
Mm.
because the basis of it is bigotry. And that's, for some reason, the stories that are covered on this don't say that clearly. They make it sound
Mm.
like, oh, there's political beliefs on both sides. And it's like, no, but
Right.
this is bigotry. This is not
Right.
wanting LGBTQ people to exist. And
Yeah.
that's the basis of it. And that's why they should have stood up, you know? And I think that's partly
And
what
what
you're
do you
seeing
think?
finally at Harvard and others is a little bit of, we can't go back on some of these values.
Fine. Yeah.
See?
But I
So,
think and I wrote a piece on this recently that I can't remember if I shared it with you, but I've been very cynical about relying on the quote unquote business case for sustainability forever, basically, because I think it's a slippery slope that if you build the logic for certain actions um, on the business case, then you're precluded from behavior that doesn't have a clear business case.
hmm
And particularly when push comes to shove. I mean, it's nice to have the win-wins, of course. And of
right.
course, there's business cases to do a lot of good things. I mean, you hire one person, there's a business case
Yep.
to hire a person. And I've been particularly kind of critical of the business schools that jumped on sustainability as the new thing that we were gonna, turn into a big profit opportunity. And I think the chickens have come home to roost because, particularly in the ESG investment, aspect of this whole thing, ESG assets under management exploded over the
Yep.
last 10 years.
Yep.
And but the logic behind it was this is good investing,
Right.
and we're going to make more money, or we're
Right.
not going to make less money. And again, the business schools churned out zillions of studies that proved that that was true, but none of them talked about the fact that there was a massive, oil trade embedded in their investment strategies.
Yep.
And the timing of it worked out to be very convenient. And so, in response to the weak oil prices, I'm trying to remember what triggered, from the pandemic,
Right.
oil prices went down, growth went down, oil prices went down, and the tech sector went to the moon.
Yeah.
And all of these ESG strategies by default are long tech and short oil.
Right. Exactly.
But then
They're heavy
Russia
on
invaded
tech.
Ukraine and it reversed. And all of a
Well, they're
sudden
heavy
oil
on
went,
tech. They're heavy on tech because there's a belief that tech is small footprint. which is
Yeah,
really
somehow tech is
complicated.
clean. Yeah,
Right.
yeah,
Really
yeah,
complicated because the
yeah,
cloud's not that light, right? It takes a
yeah,
lot of energy. AI is booming,
yeah,
energy growth.
and
It's
people putting
complicated.
together iPhones in China are jumping out the window.
Well, but yeah, I mean, as you know, the problem, the core problem that the kind of ESG critics from within the sustainability community have pointed out is that it turned out that those funds were created with the single materiality, meaning they're
Right.
assessing companies on whether the sustainability issues would affect them as an investment,
The
which
outside
allowed you to
in.
put
Yeah,
Exxon high up because you're like, oh, climate's not going to affect them right now. You know,
yeah,
like it without the double materiality, it wasn't actually
yeah.
what people thought it was. And no, and I agree. I was never really pleased ESG became synonymous with sustainability. They're really not similar. They're not the same thing. So I
Right.
don't really mind the death of ESG as a phrase right now. That one's probably a good thing. But it, it was,
Well, but I'm talking about I think there's a deeper issue here, which is that because we believe in business, we collectively as a culture, and certainly anyone involved in business believes in business as a force for good. Um, and we know that there's a business case to do a lot of things that are the right thing. We've shied away from talking about ethics
yeah,
and morals and
yeah,
the hard choices that ultimately are involved. And the the expression I always like to say is not what's the business case for sustainability, but what's the
right,
sustainability case for your business. And I I
right,
think I think part of what we if we're smart about learning from this experience, it's that we can't rely on the business case for sustainability or the business case for DEI or the business case for anything. We
right,
have to actually have some principles,
right.
some moral, ethical principles. And if businesses are trapped in a system that doesn't allow them to have them, then, and there's no governance to force them, then, we're out of luck. I mean,
Yeah.
one or the other.
No, I agree. Look, I mean, we've talked about this and I've written about this for many years about the business case. I saw a professor talking about the tyranny of the business case on diversity. This issue of does
Yeah, you saw business school professors talk about it?
it was I was at an event. I'm not sure he was a business school professor.
Yeah.
He was a professor at Harvard, and
I
um,
bet it wasn't a business school professor.
no, I don't think he was, but
Yeah.
it was a great phrase, and I'd seen versions of it, but it kind of stuck with me. I've said this a lot that this quest for does sustainability outperform? Like this question, do
Right.
ESG funds,
Right.
even if correctly constructed, even if it was a good list of companies
Right.
doing real sustainability work, I'm exaggerating a little bit, but it's a question that you don't really ask about any other investment thesis. You don't go, we're launching a new biotech fund. Will it always outperform? If something
Yeah.
always outperformed, all the money in the market would go to it. It's a
Right.
ludicrous question, right? And
Right.
it's only asked, I feel like there's this burden of proof on sustainability that I've, focused on in many dimensions within companies, from outside companies, that somehow it has to prove every little ROI, right, to the decimal place.
Right.
And the proof I have now that it's actually kind of a big myth that companies do everything on exact numbers and ROI is AI. There's so much
Yeah.
money being funneled into it in companies without an ROI. They don't know, but they believe it's strategic. And that's why they get the big bucks in theory at the top, is to make strategic choices. And
Right.
I think we've learned behavioral economics, behavioral psychology over decades that we generally make decisions on some combination of things and then look for the data or stories that back it up. It's
Exactly.
not the other way around.
Exactly.
And so
Exactly.
clearly
Which
there's a
tells
belief,
us what the identity really is in the
right?
business.
Well, part of that story that's been built for 100 years is that anything that's environmental is, so especially environmental, but also social, is anti-business, right? Um,
Right.
is always going to cost more. And so I think what maybe gets confused for being win-win, I've been accused of saying everything's win-win, which I don't think I've ever said, but I will defend to the death that in the long run, of course, it's win-win because it's lose-lose. Like we
Right.
can't function on a dead planet, right? It's
Alive
the
is better
point.
than dead. Yeah.
I mean,
Right.
it is win-win in that sense. I've never said every short-term investment is win immediately, but like I think to fight the belief and that it's always more expensive is kind of what my mission has been, to say, well, here's a bunch of value that's created, and sometimes you got to look at value in much broader terms than just cash. Like, what has it done to employee engagement and license to operate and all those other things that we don't measure very well that are real,
Yeah.
right? What is the
Which, by the way,
resilience?
is where the net positive, merges with regenerative.
Right,
And the regenerative is all the stuff that is unseen potential that we can create the conditions to manifest. That's
right.
that's the final
Well,
frontier, really. That's it.
I I'm exhausted with the business case. I mean, I've had to answer the question, does it pay? Doesn't it always cost more? Like seemingly daily
Yeah,
for 20 years, and
yeah,
I'm tired of it, right? Because the case, I can post a link later to kind of a free LinkedIn learning class I did on just the continued logic for action on sustainability and climate. That there's kind of to me a three-pronged thing, which is we need to, like existential threats, like so we survive. We have to in business because there's legislation and stakeholder pressure, and we want to because the typical business case, we can save money, we can build revenue. I have said to people, and I admit that the need to part, the existential, I find it surreal that that's not enough. Like that hasn't been enough of an argument for all these years. That if like I happened to be sitting with a CEO the week after Pacific Palisades burned down, and I would think if you had control over a big company after watching that, you'd be like, oh my God, what can I do? like what should we do to
yeah,
decarbonize as fast as possible? Instead, it was like, I don't see an indication from customers that they're willing to pay. This was the conversation we had, that we're willing to pay for the zero carbon version of our product. And I'm like, I'm finding it surreal, right? Like we're killing
yeah,
things and we're still talking about it like, we'll do it if it pays in traditional terms, and
yeah,
this has been the tyranny. And look, I've spent 20 years trying to break people out of this way of thinking, and I don't know if it's been successful at all, honestly. I don't.
yeah.
Um,
That's why you've got gray hair.
well, I started, yeah, I got much grayer, but look, we're always in this field in counterfactuals. I mean,
Yeah,
we're winning and losing. That's the duality of things, right? Because we got it on the agenda at almost every big company, but emissions are still rising. That is by definition losing on climate. So people say, are you optimistic or pessimistic? I'm like, I don't know. The emissions are still rising. That's not pessimism. But the counterfactuals, what would it have been like without all of the work of, I'm assuming most of the people on this call, like
right,
all the people
right,
working on this? I, I think it would have been worse. I hope, I believe we
right,
just haven't,
right,
we haven't hit the tipping point yet,
right.
right? On some of these metrics.
Yeah,
But it would have been, I think, far worse if we didn't have some of this movement.
yeah.
Um,
No question.